Welcome back, everybody. This is part two of our theory of knowledge study of the area of knowledge of history. So, we're trying to look at how scholarship production happens in history, how knowledge is legitimized and formulated, and then how consensus is reached about what actual historical knowledge is, should be, and what it means. And before we actually get to our part two study of studying individual historians and the individual perspectives of historians, I think it's important to just mention the ways that some of the WOKs, the ways of knowing, interact with historical knowledge. Some of them are kind of obvious and trivial, but some of them are kind of interesting and maybe should bear further attention in order to critically analyze how we formulate scholarship in history. So, obviously, with sense perception, it can be deceiving, but we do rely quite often on eyewitness accounts, memoirs, and people's life experiences in order to author our historical meaning. Now, sometimes these eyewitness accounts can see details differently, and of course, memory can be malleable. And if you start putting things in memoir form, sometimes you're fictionalizing the narrative. I know personally, I can say that my father is currently writing a memoir, and he's had it professionally edited a couple of times. And they're often recommending changes to the story to the point where he wasn't really sure what really happened anymore because they embellished it in order to get more people to read it, basically. So this happens sometimes. But of course, we need our sense perception to select sources, to figure out what sources are relevant and whether or not they're legitimate. And of course, to interpret artifacts is an interesting exercise, to try to look at something and just try to see what it might have meant in the context of a society at that time. Emotion is really what makes history interesting, I would argue. It really offers the imaginative interpretation of historical fact, and that's a lot of what gives our lives meaning. It gives meanings to the context of historical fact. It's what makes it relevant to us, is how it makes us feel, how it guides us in our behavior. So I think that it's really important to remember just how much of a role emotion plays in our historical understanding. Can you think of any examples of this? Now, we could also ask, what are the emotional reasons why people write histories? This would often influence what actually goes into a written history. So sometimes there is cause for celebration of events or people, then there's condemnation. A lot of people are motivated to try to prevent things from ever happening again. There are attempts to explain things, to try to figure out causes. And then, of course, there are the apologias, the apologies for regretful actions of the past. Sometimes these turn into revisionist histories where people try to actually change the narrative in order to create innocence for a guilty party, or at least uh, a specter of innocence, anyway. And then, of course, there's often the attempt to just explain or justify certain events or actions in history. And these can also often be connected to emotion, and it might beg the question how much truth might be influenced by certain kinds of accounts. Now, ultimately, I would argue that our general sense of history gives us a kind of collective identity. This is certainly true when we learn about our nation state and our nationalism, or at least our community's interpretation of what the nation state means. And it's true in terms of religion and various other kinds of group identities. All of them have to share some kind of sense of historical fact in order to have social agreements. Now, there's also, of course, an obvious connection to reason. We have to try to construct historical facts into some kind of framework of knowledge. We have to figure out what doesn't really make sense in history. And that helps us to test the historian's selection of facts. So perhaps you can actually take certain facts and then spin it into a story that creates a bigger untruth. This is actually one of the things that was um, levied against Holocaust deniers, is that they might actually pick a few historical facts, but then spin a much grander historical narrative out of it that can be disproven. So that's the example that comes to my mind. But can you think of any other historians that you might actually challenge how they're selecting facts and how they actually create a historical framework? I might think of someone like Howard Zinn, who is saying that he's doing a polemic history, that he's doing an angry kind of history to point out the people that got lost in the historical record. But his selection of facts is very limited to what supports his kind of historical narrative about America. And there are people who have tried to counter that history by creating an alternative kind of card stacking, where they omit many of the unrealized dreams of America and just kind of pile on with the actual successes relative to history in other parts of Europe. Now, this is the most fun part of talking about WOKs in history. And that's talking about language, because language really frames our historical thought. And it's very hard to detach your historical understanding from some of the language that you used. Um, but language can actually be a measurement for how our historical knowledge works. So, in some sense, we can use language to measure bias. We can try to look for word choice and the type of evidence used and the type of evidence that's not used, and create a kind of framework for judging attitudes. Like, I can tell that this piece was a piece trying to promote this particular interest group, or I can tell that this piece was angry about this particular issue. And when you can get at that, you can really understand primary sources, and it also helps you understand the intentions of historians better. Also, language helps us measure reliability. When we look at the language of the source, it can help us judge how appropriate it is, how closely it is to the issue that we're looking for. Now, sometimes some people might say that primary sources are more authentic, but might be kind of biased because they don't have the gift of retrospection. But secondary sources are basically selected pieces of evidence that are willfully strung into an analysis and a narrative about history after the fact. So there's some pros and cons to both of these kinds of sides, but the language that's used helps us measure um, the reliability and the authenticity of these sources. And part of the way that we do that is by searching for intent. And that is found and embedded in language very often. Sometimes it's very obvious, and sometimes it's subtle in just word choices and how people had worldviews constructed based on their word choices. But there are various established frameworks of historiography about how to understand language and history, and how to do research, and how to write history as well. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about historians and the actual histories they produce. And this is the most fun part of the talking about language and history, and that's the study of etymology. Now, etymology is the study of the origin of words. And the cool thing about language is that it changes over time. New words appear, old ones just don't get used anymore, and most confusingly, surviving words change meaning over time. And that can make it really tricky to study historical sources and to study historians and understand their intent. Etymology is the study of the origin of words, and it can be really fun to actually look at where some expressions come from. Now, a more sophisticated study of this is called philology. This was actually a really popular branch of study in the 1800s and has kind of fallen off, especially in the later 20th century. But it's the study of languages and their historical development, and how structures of grammar influence thought, and how those relationships of thinking produce different kinds of ideas in language later. So it begs the question, if we don't really understand how words can be used, how do we decide how reliable and trustworthy they are? And this can be really, really tricky and sometimes a path to confusion more than truth. Let's look at some examples. When we look at how words can move over time, if we take a word like awful, literally awful used to mean awful, an awe-inspiring experience, something that would make you say, wow, holy cow, oh my gosh. And that was more of the use of the word in the late 1800s. And it has generally grown to mean, terrible or something that's disgraceful. So the word has kind of morphed over time. Similarly, the word gay back in the 1920s and 30s, definitely in America, kind of meant happy and having a great time. And it somehow got transmorphed into this meaning of, or this connotative meaning became its denotative meaning of homosexuality. Also, in the kind of post-war generation, making love was an expression used for kind of dating and building a relationship. And of course, it has a very, very different meaning today, even though that's just not really that long ago. And of course, if you look at like political terms like socialism, oh my gosh, I mean, people deploy that word in so many different ways that it almost doesn't mean anything anymore. I mean, what is socialism exactly? Is social security socialism? And how exactly do you tell when something is socialist and when it's not? How much government involvement does it need to be socialist? It's kind of bizarre the way that these words get deployed. All right, so next time we're going to look at the actual individual historians, and we're going to check out those schools of historiography, which is what you'd kind of study in a college senior seminar about history, about the different philosophies of how to build historical knowledge and how to write about history. All right, so I hope you guys found some of this stuff interesting, and I'll hope to hear your comments on Edmodo. Take care, everybody. Hope you're all doing well.